Marcus Chen had been with the Special Operations Unit for exactly 37 days when the call came through. The young sniper was still learning the ropes, still trying to prove himself among seasoned veterans who had seen action across 3 different continents. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his gear, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that came with knowing this was his first real mission. The briefing room was dimly lit, filled with the low murmur of experienced operators discussing wind patterns and elevation charts. Marcus sat quietly in the back, his XM-09 rifle case propped against his chair. The weapon was his pride and joy, a precision instrument that he had trained with for months but never used in actual combat. His instructor's words echoed in his mind about patience, breathing control, and the mathematics of long-distance shooting. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his weathered face serious as he began outlining the mission. A high-value target had been located in a compound nestled deep in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. The target was a bomb maker responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, and intelligence suggested he would be moving locations within the next 48 hours. This was their only window of opportunity. The twist that made everyone in the room sit up straighter was the distance. The only viable shooting position was an abandoned observation post nearly 3,000 yards from the target compound. Most of the veterans in the room had never attempted a shot beyond 2,000 yards in combat conditions. The record for the unit stood at 2,400 yards, set by Master Sergeant Rodriguez 3 years prior. Marcus felt his throat go dry as the colonel's eyes swept the room, looking for volunteers. The Phantom team, the unit's elite sniper squad, was already discussing among themselves whether the shot was even possible. These were men who had made impossible shots look routine, yet they were hesitating. The wind conditions in the mountain passes were notoriously unpredictable, and the target would only be visible for a few seconds at most. Sergeant Williams, the team leader of Phantom Squad, stood up and studied the satellite imagery projected on the wall. He traced the trajectory with his finger, calculating bullet drop, wind drift, and the dozen other variables that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. The mathematics alone were staggering. At that distance, the bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target, traveling in an arc that would peak almost 60 feet above the intended point of impact. The room fell silent as Marcus slowly raised his hand. Every head turned toward him, and he could feel the weight of their collective experience bearing down on him. Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that the newest member of the unit was volunteering for what many considered an impossible shot. The seasoned operators began voicing their concerns. The rookie had never fired the XM-09 in combat conditions. He had never dealt with the psychological pressure of knowing that lives hung in the balance of his trigger pull. The mountain weather was unpredictable, with winds that could shift direction and intensity within minutes. One veteran pointed out that even if Marcus could make the shot, the chances of the target appearing in the narrow window of opportunity were slim at best. Marcus stood up, his voice steady despite the chaos of thoughts racing through his mind. He had studied the ballistics charts religiously, had practiced the mental calculations until they became second nature. More importantly, he had something the veterans might have lost over years of combat, the absolute belief that the impossible was simply another word for untested. The colonel studied the young sniper for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential outcome. The target was too valuable to let slip away, and waiting for better conditions might mean losing him entirely. Intelligence suggested the bomb maker had information about planned attacks that could save hundreds of lives. The decision was made with the weight of command, knowing that success would eliminate a significant threat, while failure would mean another opportunity lost. As the briefing concluded, Marcus began the mental preparation that would consume the next 18 hours. He would need to account for temperature variations between the firing position and the target area, the rotation of the Earth during the bullet's flight time, and atmospheric pressure changes that could affect the projectile's path. Every variable had to be calculated, recalculated, and then trusted completely when the moment came to pull the trigger. The helicopter lifted off at 0300 hours, its rotors cutting through the cold mountain air as it carried Marcus and his spotter toward the designated insertion point. The flight would take them to within 2 miles of the observation post, after which they would need to hike through treacherous terrain under cover of darkness. Marcus clutched his rifle case tightly, running through the ballistic calculations one more time in his head. Corporal Davies, his assigned spotter, was a veteran with 12 years of experience in special operations. Despite his initial skepticism about working with a rookie on such a critical mission, he had spent the previous evening helping Marcus refine his calculations. The two men had worked through dozens of scenarios, accounting for every possible variable that could affect the shot. Davies carried the laser rangefinder, weather monitoring equipment, and backup communication gear that would be essential for the mission's success. The insertion went smoothly, with the helicopter dropping them at a rocky outcrop 3 miles from their destination. The pilot wished them luck with a subtle thumbs up before disappearing into the night sky, leaving Marcus and Davies alone in the vast wilderness. The silence was overwhelming after the constant noise of the aircraft, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through the mountain peaks. The hike to the observation post tested every aspect of Marcus's training. The altitude made breathing difficult, and the weight of his equipment seemed to increase with every step. The XM-09 rifle, normally a precision tool that felt like an extension of his body, now felt like a burden as they navigated loose scree slopes and narrow ridges in complete darkness. Davies led the way, using night vision equipment to guide them along the safest route. 4 hours later, they reached the abandoned observation post just as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon. The position was exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. A concrete bunker built into the mountainside, with a clear line of sight to the target compound below. The previous occupants had left behind some basic equipment, but the position had been abandoned for over a year and showed signs of weather damage. Marcus immediately began setting up his shooting position, while Davies established their communication equipment and began taking atmospheric readings. The distance to the target compound measured exactly 2,047 yards according to the laser rangefinder, with an elevation difference of nearly 800 feet. The angle of the shot would add another layer of complexity to the already challenging mathematics. The weather conditions were far from ideal. Wind speeds at their position were gusting between 15 and 25 miles per hour, with the direction shifting unpredictably every few minutes. The temperature differential between their mountain position and the valley floor where the target compound sat was significant, creating thermal layers that would affect the bullet's trajectory in ways that were difficult to predict. Davies spent the morning hours studying the wind patterns through his spotting scope, looking for any consistent trends that might help them time the shot. He noticed that the wind seemed to calm slightly every 40 to 50 minutes, creating brief windows where the conditions were more stable. These observations would be crucial when the time came to take the shot. Marcus used the waiting time to familiarize himself with the specific characteristics of his firing position. The concrete platform was solid, providing an excellent foundation for the rifle's bipod. He practiced his shooting stance dozens of times, ensuring that his body position was perfectly consistent. The muscle memory had to be flawless, because he would only get one chance when the target appeared. The psychological pressure began to mount as the day progressed. Marcus found himself second-guessing calculations that he had verified multiple times. The magnitude of the shot was unprecedented in his experience, and the knowledge that the entire unit was watching his performance added weight to every decision. Davies noticed his partner's tension and began sharing stories from his own early missions, helping to normalize the anxiety that came with high-stakes operations. As afternoon approached, intelligence reports confirmed that the target was still in the compound and was expected to emerge for his regular afternoon inspection of the surrounding area. The window of opportunity would be narrow, perhaps 30 seconds at most, and the target would be partially obscured by structures within the compound. Marcus would need to identify his target quickly and take the shot before the opportunity disappeared. The final preparations began 2 hours before the expected appearance time. Marcus cleaned his rifle one last time, checking every component for proper function. The ammunition had been selected carefully, with each bullet weighed to ensure consistency. Davies updated the atmospheric readings and confirmed the wind patterns he had observed throughout the day. Both men knew that everything they had done to prepare would ultimately come down to a single moment of perfect execution. With 2 hours remaining before the target's expected appearance, Marcus and Davies entered the final phase of their preparation. The atmosphere in the observation post became intensely focused as both men understood that every calculation, every measurement, and every decision made in the next hour would determine the success or failure of their mission. Davies had been monitoring wind conditions throughout the day, and his data revealed a concerning pattern. The wind in the valley where the target compound sat was behaving differently from the wind at their elevation. Crosswinds at different altitudes were creating a complex pattern that would push the bullet in multiple directions during its 4-second flight time. The bullet would encounter headwinds for the first portion of its trajectory, then crosswinds as it descended toward the target area. Marcus spread his ballistic charts across the concrete platform, double-checking every number against the real-world conditions they were facing. The standard ballistic data for the XM-09 rifle provided a starting point, but the extreme range of this shot pushed beyond the published tables. He had to extrapolate the bullet's performance based on mathematical models that had never been tested at such distances. In actual combat conditions, the temperature readings added another layer of complexity to the calculations. The air at their mountain position was significantly colder than the air in the valley below, creating density variations that would affect the bullet's flight path. Colder air was denser, which would slow the bullet initially, but as it descended into warmer air, its velocity would be affected differently. Marcus had to account for this gradual transition in his calculations. Davies provided continuous updates on the atmospheric pressure, which had been dropping steadily throughout the day. Lower pressure meant thinner air, which would reduce drag on the bullet but also make its trajectory less predictable. The barometric changes were subtle but significant at the extreme range they were attempting. Every variable seemed to be working against them, yet Marcus continued refining his calculations with methodical precision. The most challenging aspect was calculating the Coriolis effect, the influence of the Earth's rotation on the bullet's flight path. At shorter ranges, this effect was negligible, but over nearly 3,000 yards and a 4-second flight time, the rotation of the planet would deflect the bullet several inches to the right. Marcus had studied this phenomenon extensively during training, but applying it in real-world conditions with so many other variables was exponentially more complex. Marcus also had to account for the spin drift of the bullet, caused by the rifling in the barrel that stabilized the projectile's flight. The XM-09's barrel twisted the bullet clockwise, which would cause a gradual drift to the right over the extended range. Combined with the Coriolis effect, wind drift, and gravitational drop, the bullet would follow a complex 3-dimensional path that required precise mathematical modeling. The elevation angle of the shot introduced additional complications. Shooting downward at such a steep angle would cause the bullet to impact higher than normal due to reduced gravitational effect during flight. The angle also affected how the wind would influence the bullet's path, as crosswinds would have a different impact on a projectile traveling at a downward angle versus level flight. Davies used his spotting scope to study the target area, identifying exactly where the target was expected to appear. The intelligence reports indicated that the bomb maker would emerge from a specific building and walk approximately 50 meters to inspect equipment stored in an outdoor area. The walking path would provide multiple potential shooting opportunities, but only for a few seconds at each position. Marcus worked through the final calculations, arriving at adjustments that seemed almost impossible to believe. The scope would need to be aimed nearly 10 feet to the left of where the target would appear, and almost 15 feet above the target to account for bullet drop. At that distance, the target would appear as little more than a speck through the scope, making precise aiming incredibly difficult. The psychological pressure intensified as Marcus realized that all their preparation would ultimately depend on perfect execution in a single moment. There would be no opportunity for a second shot, no chance to adjust based on where the first bullet impacted. The mathematics had to be perfect, the rifle had to perform flawlessly, and Marcus had to control every aspect of his breathing and trigger pull with absolute precision. Davies began the final countdown sequence, monitoring radio communications to track any changes in the target's expected appearance time. Intelligence confirmed that movement had been detected in the compound, suggesting that the target was preparing to emerge. Both men knew that the next 30 minutes would determine whether months of training and hours of preparation would result in mission success or failure. Marcus settled into his final shooting position, adjusting the rifle's bipod and ensuring that his body was perfectly aligned. The scope crosshairs were positioned according to his calculations, aimed at what appeared to be empty space, but mathematically represented the intersection point where bullet and target would meet after a 4-second journey through space. Back at the base command center, the Phantom team gathered around the radio communications equipment, listening to the updates from Marcus and Davies at the observation post. The elite snipers who had initially questioned the rookie's ability to make such an extraordinary shot now found themselves invested in his success. Despite their earlier skepticism, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, holder of the unit's previous long-distance record, studied the tactical display showing the positions of both the shooting team and the target compound. He had attempted shots at similar distances during his career, but had never faced the combination of challenges that Marcus was now confronting. The wind conditions alone would have caused Rodriguez to recommend aborting the mission under normal circumstances. Sergeant Williams, the Phantom team leader, monitored the weather reports coming from the observation post with growing concern. The atmospheric conditions were deteriorating rather than improving, with wind speeds increasing and becoming more unpredictable. He found himself questioning whether they should have recommended that the mission be postponed until more favorable conditions developed. The team's communications specialist maintained constant contact with Davies, receiving detailed updates on the preparations at the firing position. Each report revealed the enormous complexity of what Marcus was attempting to accomplish. The mathematical calculations required for the shot were beyond anything the Phantom team had encountered in their combined decades of experience. Colonel Harrison observed the proceedings from his position at the command table, aware that the reputation of his entire unit rested on the outcome of this single shot. The intelligence value of the target was enormous, but the risk of failure was equally significant. A missed shot would not only result in a lost opportunity, but would also alert the enemy to their surveillance capabilities and compromise future operations. The Phantom team members began discussing the technical aspects of the shot among themselves, each offering their perspective on the challenges Marcus was facing. They calculated that the bullet would need to maintain supersonic velocity throughout its flight to avoid the unpredictable trajectory changes that occurred when projectiles dropped below the speed of sound. At the extreme range Marcus was attempting, this requirement pushed the XM-09 rifle to the absolute limits of its design capabilities. Corporal Jackson, the team's youngest member before Marcus arrived, expressed admiration for the rookie's willingness to attempt something that more experienced operators had declined to try. He recognized the courage it took to volunteer for a mission where failure would be public and career-defining. The psychological pressure of knowing that the entire unit was monitoring his performance would be overwhelming for most shooters. The radio crackled with updates from the observation post as Davies reported that the target was showing signs of movement within the compound. Intelligence analysts confirmed that the bomb maker was following his usual routine and would likely emerge within the next 15 minutes. The tension in the command center increased dramatically as everyone realized that the moment of truth was rapidly approaching. Rodriguez found himself mentally walking through the shot sequence, imagining the challenges that Marcus was facing at that moment. The veteran sniper knew from experience how easy it was for doubt to creep in during the final minutes before a critical shot. Every calculation would be questioned, every variable would seem insurmountable, and the natural human tendency would be to second-guess decisions that had been carefully planned for hours. Williams began monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, coordinating with intelligence assets in the area to ensure that any changes in the tactical situation would be immediately communicated to the shooting team. The last thing they needed was for the target to deviate from his expected pattern or for unexpected threats to appear in the area of operations. The technical specialists in the command center were tracking the ballistic requirements of the shot using their own computer models, arriving at calculations that closely matched Marcus's manual computations. The mathematical precision required was staggering, with margin for error measured in fractions of degrees and split-second timing. Even with perfect calculations, environmental factors could still cause a miss. Colonel Harrison received a final confirmation from intelligence sources that the target was indeed the high-value individual they had been tracking. The bomb maker's elimination would disrupt a network responsible for attacks across the region and potentially save dozens of lives. The strategic importance of the mission provided additional motivation. but also increased the pressure on Marcus to perform flawlessly. The Phantom team members fell silent as Davies reported that the target had appeared in the compound and was beginning his routine inspection walk. After hours of preparation and calculation, the moment had arrived when theoretical mathematics would meet real-world physics. Marcus was now alone with his rifle, his training, and the enormous responsibility of executing one of the most challenging shots in military history. The command center held its collective breath as they waited for the next radio transmission. Years of experience had taught the Phantom team that long-distance shooting was as much about mental discipline as technical skill. Marcus would need to control his breathing, steady his heartbeat, and execute perfect trigger control while managing the psychological pressure of knowing that failure meant the loss of a critical target. Davies pressed his eye to the spotting scope and whispered urgently into his radio microphone. The target had emerged from the main building exactly as intelligence had predicted, but the timing was different from what they had expected. Instead of the leisurely walk described in the briefings, the bomb maker was moving more quickly, checking equipment and appearing agitated about something that had clearly disrupted his normal routine. Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate as he acquired the target through his rifle scope. At 2,850 yards, the figure appeared impossibly small, barely distinguishable from the surrounding structures and equipment in the compound. The mathematical calculations that had consumed hours of preparation now had to be translated into precise scope, adjustments, and perfect timing. The wind conditions that Davies had been monitoring throughout the day suddenly shifted, creating a brief moment of relative calm in the valley below. The flags and cloth hanging around the compound stopped their constant movement, indicating that the crosswinds that had been their primary concern were temporarily reduced. Davies recognized this as the window they had been waiting for and quietly alerted Marcus. Marcus controlled his breathing, using the techniques drilled into him during months of training. Each breath had to be measured and controlled, with the shot fired during the natural pause between exhale and inhale when his body was most stable. The trigger pull had to be smooth and straight back, with no lateral pressure that could disturb the rifle's alignment even by fractions of an inch. Through his scope, Marcus could see the target moving along the predicted path, but the man's pace was faster than anticipated. The window of opportunity would be even narrower than they had planned for, requiring split-second timing to catch the target in the brief moment when he would be fully exposed and stationary. Marcus tracked the movement, calculating the lead time required for the bullet's 4-second flight. Davies provided a continuous stream of information, calling out wind conditions, range confirmation, and target movement. His voice was calm and professional, but Marcus could hear the underlying tension as both men realized they were attempting something that pushed beyond the boundaries of what was considered possible with current technology and human skill. The mathematical calculations that Marcus had spent hours perfecting now compressed into instinctive adjustments as he fine-tuned his scope position. The target was approaching the optimal position in his walking pattern, the brief moment when he would pause to examine a piece of equipment. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds to identify this pause, confirm his sight picture, and execute the shot. The XM-09 rifle felt solid and familiar in Marcus's hands despite the extraordinary circumstances. Every component had been checked and rechecked. The ammunition had been carefully selected for consistency, and the scope had been zeroed with precision. The weapon was performing exactly as designed, but the success of the shot would ultimately depend on Marcus's ability to execute perfect technique under enormous pressure. Davies called out the final countdown as the target approached the predetermined position. Wind conditions remained stable, atmospheric readings were within acceptable parameters, and the target was following the predicted path. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of his world narrowing to just the crosshairs in his scope and the gentle pressure of his finger on the trigger. The moment arrived with startling suddenness. The target paused exactly where intelligence had predicted, presenting the clear shot that Marcus had been waiting for. All the hours of calculation, all the preparation, and all the pressure from the watching unit compressed into a single instant of perfect focus. Marcus's breathing stopped, his heartbeat seemed to pause, and his finger applied the final pressure to the trigger. The XM-09 fired with its characteristic sharp crack, sending the precisely calculated projectile on its journey across the valley. The recoil was minimal but noticeable, and Marcus immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while keeping his scope trained on the target area. The bullet was now in flight, following the complex trajectory that mathematics had predicted but that physics would ultimately determine. 4 seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as both Marcus and Davies waited to see the result of their effort. The bullet was traveling at over twice the speed of sound, but at the extreme range, even this velocity seemed inadequate for the distance it had to cover. Marcus maintained his sight picture, ready to call out the impact location to help Davies spot the result. The target was still visible through the scope when the bullet arrived, traveling along the precise path that Marcus's calculations had predicted. The impact was instantaneous and definitive, confirming that every variable had been correctly accounted for and that the shot had achieved its intended result. The mathematical precision required for success had been matched by flawless execution under pressure that few marksmen would ever experience. The radio crackled to life in the command center as Davies confirmed what everyone had been waiting to hear. The shot had found its mark with precision that seemed to defy the mathematical odds they had been calculating throughout the day. Marcus had successfully engaged a target at 2,850 yards under conditions that the most experienced snipers in the unit had considered nearly impossible. Colonel Harrison immediately initiated the extraction protocol, knowing that the successful shot would trigger increased enemy activity in the area. The helicopter that would retrieve Marcus and Davies was already airborne, racing toward the pickup point as fast as the mountain terrain would allow. Intelligence assets in the region confirmed that the target had been eliminated, and that the bomb-making operation had been successfully disrupted. The Phantom team members looked at each other with expressions that mixed disbelief with professional respect. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, whose previous record had just been shattered by over 400 yards, was the first to speak. He acknowledged that Marcus had accomplished something that redefined what they thought was possible with their equipment and training. The rookie had not just succeeded. He had set a new standard for long-distance precision shooting. Marcus and Davies began the systematic process of packing their equipment and preparing for extraction. The adrenaline that had sustained Marcus through the shot was beginning to fade, replaced by the exhaustion that comes after intense mental and physical stress. Davies helped secure the XM-09 rifle in its case, treating the weapon with the reverence due to an instrument that had just made history. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, with the aircraft arriving at the pickup point exactly on schedule. As they lifted off from the mountain position, Marcus could see the target compound in the distance now bustling with activity as enemy forces responded to the successful strike. The intelligence gathered from the operation would provide valuable information about the broader terrorist network. Back at the base, word of the extraordinary shot spread quickly through the special operations community. The technical aspects of what Marcus had accomplished were analyzed and documented, with ballistics experts struggling to understand how all the variables had aligned perfectly for such an unprecedented success. The shot would be studied and discussed for years as an example of what was possible with perfect preparation and flawless execution. The formal debriefing took place the following morning, with Marcus and Davies providing detailed accounts of every aspect of the mission. The mathematical calculations were verified and entered into the unit's database, creating new reference data for future long-distance engagements. The environmental conditions were thoroughly documented to help other snipers understand the challenges that had been overcome. Colonel Harrison recommended Marcus for commendation, recognizing not only the technical achievement, but also the courage required to volunteer for a mission that experienced operators had declined. The successful elimination of the high-value target had disrupted planned attacks and provided intelligence that would save lives across the region. The strategic impact of the mission extended far beyond the single shot that had made it possible. The Phantom team welcomed Marcus as a full member, acknowledging that his achievement had earned him a place among the unit's most skilled operators. The rookie designation was quietly dropped as his peers recognized that anyone capable of making such a shot under extreme conditions had demonstrated mastery of their craft. The team dynamics shifted to accommodate someone who had proven himself under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Intelligence reports over the following weeks confirmed the broader impact of the successful mission. The bomb makers' network began to collapse as key members were captured or fled the region. The equipment and materials that had been used to create improvised explosive devices were seized, preventing numerous planned attacks. The ripple effects of the single shot continued to unfold long after Marcus had returned to base. Marcus found himself thrust into a role he had never expected, serving as an instructor for other snipers who wanted to understand the techniques and calculations required for extreme long-distance shooting. His methodical approach to ballistics and his willingness to attempt the impossible became part of the unit's training curriculum. The shot at 2,150 yards became a benchmark for what could be achieved with proper preparation and unwavering confidence. The weapon that had made the historic shot, the XM-09 rifle, was retired from active service and placed in the unit's trophy case. The rifle had performed flawlessly under conditions that pushed it to the absolute limits of its design capabilities. Marcus was issued a new rifle, but he maintained and cared for the XM-09 that had carried him through his most defining moment as a professional marksman. Years later, as Marcus advanced through the ranks and took on leadership responsibilities within the special operations community, he continued to emphasize the importance of mathematical precision and mental discipline in long-distance shooting. The lesson of the 2,150-yard shot was not just about technical skill, but about the confidence to attempt what others considered impossible when the mission demanded exceptional performance.